starting now a new parak, chapter 2 of Pirkei Avot. If you have a text in front of you, it would be useful. You can find it in most Sidurim, certainly the Art Scroll Sidur, you can find it after Shabbos Mincha, and most other Sidurim will have it there as well. So make your way to chapter 2, Mishnah 1. Rebbe Omer. Now, I'd like to comment a little bit about the personality and the historical context of the personality whose teachings are recorded in our Mishnah. Excuse me. If you remember, the beginning of Pirkei Avos started with the words Moshe Kibel Torah Sinai. Again, we just celebrated that on Shavuos. Moshe received the Torah at Sinai. Umasara Yehoshua, and he transmitted it to Yehoshua of Yehoshua the Zekanim. And the Mishnah, our tractate, traces very briefly the transmission of the Torah from Moshe through the subsequent generations. And we have a reference to the Anshe Knesset Hagedol, the men of the Great Assembly. We have the name in particular of Shimon HaTzadik, one of the last of the men of the Great Assembly and one of the first of the sages of the Mishnah. And we have his teaching, and we have a man called Antignos Ish Socho, who was his disciple, and so on. The Mishnah records generation by generation who were the successors to each of the great personalities of the previous generation, who learned from them and whose teachings are recorded in the Mishnah. Remember, a few weeks ago, we had the personalities of Hillel and Shammai, two of the very well-known early sages of the Mishnah. Now, what's interesting is that the subsequent teachers whose teachings are recorded are all descendants of Hillel. So we have the grandson of Hillel, the great-grandson of Hillel. So we have Rabban Gamliel, and now we have Rebbe. Rebbe was one of the descendants of Hillel, Hazaken Hillel, the elder. And it's interesting, he is the only sage that who is identified usually with no personal name, nor his father's name, nor his title. He's simply known as Rebbe. Rebbe, our teacher, our rabbi. And this was a mark of greatest esteem, that it wasn't necessary to identify him in any further way. He is the rabbi par excellence. What was his real name? Who can tell me? The real name of Rebbe was Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, Rabbi Judah the Prince. Right, Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi. He was a son of Rabban Gamliel, whose teaching was recorded, Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, whose teaching was recorded in the previous Mishnah at the end of the first chapter. So he was Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, Rabbi Judah the Prince, and he lived from approximately 135 to 220 of the Common Era. We know his dates. I'm not saying those dates are strictly precise, but we have quite a good idea about when he lived, and it was around that time, as I said, from around 135. Now, 135 was the time of the Bar Kokhba revolt, and the generation that followed was a time of extreme persecution, the Hadrianic persecutions. Yet, when Rebbe Yehuda Hanassi grew to maturity, there was a relative let up in the intensity of the persecution. Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi lived in a time of relative peace and stability and prosperity, and he himself was a person of great wealth, of great prestige, of great, I would say, charisma. I'm not saying we have evidence for that, but he was respected, he was admired, and he was a statesman as well. We have much evidence that he was on good terms with the famous Roman personality Antoninus, and that's mentioned in the Talmud in many places. Who was Antoninus? Some have suggested he was Marcus Aurelius, the Roman emperor. Others have questioned whether it could actually be the Roman emperor himself. It may have been the local Roman governor of the land of Israel at that time. But they were on friendly terms, and we have a number of dialogues between them which the Talmud records. And not for the most part, not confrontational or aggressive, but more collegial almost. So he was the leading rabbinic figure of the age, but at the same time, he was the Nasi. That is to say, he was the political leader as well, and actually he was a descendant, as was Hillel, his ancestor, of David HaMelech himself. So these were the family that had the most prestige and the most the natural leaders of the Jewish people, and so they were for a number of generations. But none of them was as important as Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi. It is not an exaggeration to say that he was the most important rabbi of all time, stretching back to Moshe Rabbeinu himself. Until Moshe Rabbeinu himself, one could contend without exaggeration that Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi was the most important rabbinic figure of all time after Moses himself. Why do I say that? What's the basis for such a dramatic and sweeping assertion? I'm sure many of you know that Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi was the one who redacted the Mishnah. He selected the teachings to be included in the Mishnah, and the Mishnah in turn encompasses or comprises the halachic basis for Judaism itself. It is the indispensable companion to the Torah, to the written Torah itself. And he, Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, selected and sifted and chose and formulated the laws that are incorporated in the Mishnah. He decided which minority opinions to preserve and which to maybe exclude because the halacha doesn't follow that view at all, even though the halacha normally does not follow the minority view either, but he would preserve it to clarify the law in order to enable subsequent scholars to evaluate the different opinions and to assess them and to clarify them, or maybe possibly to decide in accordance with one or with the other opinion. Sometimes we don't have a rule of thumb to fall back on, like the halacha follows the majority. Very often the Mishnah will record two opinions, one of Rabbi Meir, one of Rabbi Yehuda. Well, which is the one that we go with? The answer is that is left to the subsequent generation to study, to evaluate, to discuss, to assess. And the one who decided which opinions to preserve in the Mishnah, that is Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi. Not only that, but again, as some of you may know, but for those who are not familiar with it, it's very worthwhile to clarify. The oral Torah for about 1,000 years, more than 1,000 years, was exactly that. It was transmitted orally. There was no official record. There was no official formulation of the oral Torah. There were unofficial notes that a person or a student or a teacher could make for himself. But to codify it and to publish it and to sort of calcify it, that was forbidden until the days of Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi. And even then, it was only because of the fear that the Torah Shabbal Peh could be lost, because of the intense persecution and because of the instability of the times when a generation offered that chance where the sages and the scholars and the students were able to get together in academies and to discuss the Torah and to clarify the Torah. Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi recognized this was an opportunity that could not be squandered. And therefore, the Mishnah was recorded under his authorship or editorship. And although his own opinion is not recorded in the Mishnah that frequently, in his extreme humility, he generally did not mention his own name. And when he does, the halacha doesn't necessarily follow him, despite his great eminence and the esteem in which he was held, because we still allow that final judgment to be left to the subsequent generations to analyze, to discuss, to compare, to challenge and to scrutinize. So the halacha may follow Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, or it may follow his colleagues or a colleague, as the case may be. So this is the extreme importance, and we'll see a hint or two to this background in the Mishnah itself. But even if we didn't, I mean, in this particular Mishnah that he teaches, but even if we didn't, the identity and the personality of Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi is worth recording. But there's more to that, more than that as well. I mentioned just very briefly his humility. He was known for his humility, which is extraordinary because, as I said, he had power, prestige, wealth, learning. He had yichus. He was descended from the great leaders of the Jewish people, generation by generation. So he had good reason to have quite a lot of self-regard, and yet he was renowned for his humility. So much so that he was known as Rabbeinu HaKadosh, our holy rabbi, because although his court was known for its opulence, and again, as the political head of the Jewish community, as well as the rabbinic head, so he needed to conduct himself with a certain panache, a certain style. It was only in keeping with his position as essentially the prince, and he's known as Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Judah the prince as well. So it was appropriate for him to conduct himself with a certain amount of opulence, and yet he himself never indulged. He himself never sort of reveled in the trappings of wealth and prestige. On his deathbed, he held up his two hands and he said, I swear that I used my hands only in the service of Hashem, and I did not benefit even as much as a small finger from the pleasures and the indulgence and the luxuries of this world. So the delicacies that were on his table, he didn't say he never ate of it, but he never had the feeling of, I'm wealthy and I'm powerful and I'm prestigious, so I can enjoy extravagant food, which maybe others can't afford. He never sort of took advantage in that way. In fact, the Gemara in Sota, the end of Sota, even says that when Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi died, Batla Anava, that humility was lost, as if to say he was the paradigm for humility, and after he died, there was no one else about whom it could be said that he is as humble as Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi. So we have the personality here of a most extraordinary and remarkable, in some ways even paradoxical personality, someone who was so great, so wealthy, etc., and yet very humble. But there's more to it as well, and here's where we see a beautiful remez in our Mishnah itself. Rebbe Omer, Ezehu derech yeshora sheyavar lo ha'adam. What is the proper path that a person should choose for himself? So already in this word sheyavar, I would like to suggest we see a hint to what I was saying, namely the idea of selection. Sheyavar is like the word borer. If you're familiar with borer, one of the forbidden activities on Shabbos is sifting and to select one from the other. It's permitted on Shabbos only in a particular way. So the word sheyavar lo adam, he should select. Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, his greatness, part of his greatness was reflected in his choice of what teachings to include within the Mishnah. We have 6 orders of the Mishnah, which collectively encompass the totality of Jewish life, all of the laws governing Jewish life in every area, in every era, in every sector. So the selectivity on his part and the choice and the formulation with great care was part of his achievement. So I see that as a remez, a little hint to what he himself did. But then he goes on to say, Kol shi tiferes lo oseha v'siferes lo min ha'adam. So not so easy to render those words in felicitous English. I'm going to read you the way it's translated here in the text that I have. Whatever path is a credit to himself and earns him the esteem of fellow men. This word tiferes, I saw that Dr. Twersky has a beautiful drash, and I'd like to elaborate upon that a little bit. Ramban, in the end of Parshas Vayechi, which is the last parsha in the book of Genesis, which describes the deathbed of Jacob, our father Jacob, when he blessed his 12 sons. And it describes his death as well. And it describes how he was interred, and he was actually embalmed, and he was buried ultimately in the cave of Machpelah, where his remains still are to this day, according to our tradition. So The Ramban refers in a kind of cryptic language, and Rabbeinu Bachaya does as well. And at the time that I looked at many years ago, I was quite taken by this. And in the notes, the editor has provided some very helpful notes as well. And just to get to the essence of what is pertinent for this discussion, there is a link, a connection between Yaakov Avinu, our father Jacob, and Yehuda Hanassi, Rabbeinu HaKadosh. There's a link, even to the point that it's suggested in the Kabbalistic tradition that he was a Gilgul, that Rabbeinu HaKadosh was a reincarnation of Yaakov Avinu. That just as it says about Yaakov Avinu that he did not die, even though actually as the Torah says explicitly, and the Talmud also acknowledges that, says, what do you mean? It says he died and they embalmed him and they buried him. So what kind of a statement is that? He didn't die. Anyway, the Talmud says that because Yaakov Avinu, his descendants are alive. So the Jewish people live, so Yaakov himself also lives in that sense. So we find a similar suggestion about Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, even though his death is described in the Talmud. But nevertheless, we have an idea which is found also in the Talmud that he would come back from the grave to recite Kiddush for his family even after his death. And it's a bit uncertain whether this means literally or just figuratively, but it says that a neighbor once knocked on the door on Friday evening, just shortly after sunset, and the maidservant said, "Shh, Rabbeinu HaKadosh is making Kiddush, so don't disturb." And when the word got out that he is coming back from the grave still to make Kiddush for his family, he stopped coming anymore because he didn't want to denigrate the stature of other tzaddikim who, after they died, they never came back from the grave. Doesn't mean he was resurrected. It means that like his soul was so pure that even departing to the next world did not prevent him from reciting Kiddush for his family. I don't know exactly what that means, but I mention it because of the connection. The Talmud says Yaakov Avinu didn't die. We have this idea that in some sense Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi as well. Also, it says in the portion of Vayechi, that Yaakov lived in Mitzrayim for 17 years. That's how the parsha begins. Vayechi Yaakov be'eretz Mitzrayim 17 shana. That Yaakov lived in Egypt for 17 years, the last 17 years of his life. He was in Egypt. Says the Talmud, or the notes on Ramban, quote a certain source where a medrash where Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi said about himself, Yaakov lived in Mitzrayim 17 years, Vayechi Yehuda b'Tziporin 17 shana. Tziporin was a city in Roman times in the Galil. It's called Tzipori. I don't know whether anyone here on this Zoom shiur has visited it. I have visited it a couple of times, and there's quite extensive archaeological excavations there. It's in the Galil, and if you have the opportunity to visit, it's well worth the effort. And this was the town of Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi. So Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi sort of evoked the common thread between Yaakov Avinu and Yehuda Hanassi himself. This much I saw in those commentaries, classic commentaries many years ago. But Dr. Twersky says something very beautiful, and he takes it a step further. He says that it's quite well known that the three patriarchs, Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, represent three important qualities. For those who are counting the Omer and have an awareness of the Spheros, then you certainly know about all of these. Abraham is associated with chesed, with loving kindness, charity, love of his fellow man. Yitzchak is associated with gvura. So Abraham, chesed is an essential feature of Jewish life and of human life, but it's not enough upon which to build a religion unto itself. We need a lot more than that. Yitzchak represents gvura. Gvura is strength. Gvura is like self-control. Gvura represents, he puts it as firmness and discipline, which balances the chesed of Abraham. But not every person is capable of achieving the high level of gvura, of discipline that was represented by Yitzchak. And so it was left to Yaakov as the third of the patriarchs to synthesize the two, to represent the balance between the two. And this is the quality of Tiferes. Yaakov is associated with the quality of Tiferes, which is the synthesis. It's like the amalgamation of the Chesed and the Gvura is Tiferes. Tiferes means beauty or glory. That's Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. And of course, it is Yaakov who is associated most closely with the Jewish people, and we are called to this day Bnei Yisrael. The state of Israel is named for Yaakov and Yisrael. So of the three, Yaakov is the Bechir Sheba Avos. He's like the choice of the three, because each of the two, Abraham and Yitzchak, are like corrective to one another. They represent the balance which we need. Yaakov personifies that. So Yaakov is Tiferes. This is our Mishnah where Rabbi Yehuda Nasi says Tiferes la'adam. The path, a person should choose a path which brings esteem to himself. But Rabbi Tversky says that in the lineage of Rabbeinu HaKodesh, we see a very similar pattern, like an echo of Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. The founder, the patriarch of that family was Hillel Hazaken. We mentioned it a few minutes ago. Hillel the elder, and Hillel represents humility, chesed, love of his fellow man. Many stories in the Talmud, we mentioned them a few weeks ago when we spoke about Hillel. I don't want to rehearse them. Hillel became the progenitor of this line of the Nesiim, the heads of the Jewish community, generation after generation. And Hillel's grandson was Rabban Gamliel. Rabban Gamliel represents authority. Rabban Gamliel was the first in that lineage. He was the Nasi, he was the prince, and he personified Gvura. Gvura means strength and authority. So Hillel corresponds to Abraham. Rabban Gamliel corresponds to Gvura, which is Yitzchak. And Rabbeinu HaKadosh represents Tiferes, the balance, the fulfillment and the synthesis of those two qualities. And that's why he is considered the rabbi par excellence, and he is the author of our mission. After that extended introduction, let's take a closer look now to see what he teaches us exactly. So he asks, Ezu derech yeshara sheyavar lo ha'adam. Now, I'd like to translate that. Which one of the proper paths should a person choose for himself? Because it doesn't just say a person should choose the straight path, the upright path. It says, which path shall he choose? Implying that a person needs to exercise judgment, needs to exercise self-awareness, needs to choose and tread a path that is right for him. And I think that this is a clear validation of what we said. It wasn't in the Pirkei shiur, it was, I think, in Or HaChaim shiur. I think I mentioned it also in my voice note from Parshas Bamidbar. Parshas Bamidbar is a census in last week's Torah reading. Not yesterday, because that was Shavuos, but the week before, 1 week ago, we did Parshas Bamidbar, which is all about the census. And the census, to be honest, is a bit technical, a bit dry, a list of names and numbers. But the idea of the census symbolizes the importance of every person and the uniqueness of every person and the path that every person needs to choose for himself. Because what's right for me is unique to me, and it's not going to be right for someone else. Of course, there are parameters within which every Jew needs to live his life. There are parameters within which every person should lead his life, not necessarily achieved in every case. But within those parameters, there are choices. There's a question of personality, of circumstance, of inclination, of what path a person is naturally attracted to. And that's what Rebbe is saying here. What path should a person choose of the paths that are options, that are accessible to him. A person needs to choose the path which is the right one for him. So he says, what features should that path have? How should a person decide whether this path in life is worthy, is legitimate, is worthwhile? So he says, Kol shehi tiferes le'oseha, if it is a credit to himself, v'tiferes lo min ha'adam, and earns him the esteem of his fellow man. What's interesting is that these two, although I'm sure in many cases they will go together, but they don't always go together. That is to say, a person may choose a path which wins him the esteem of others, but he can lose his own self-respect. If a person is outwardly devout, but inwardly he is corrupt, and he acts in a way which he knows in his heart is hypocritical, he is depriving himself of his own self-esteem. Now, he may be addicted to that way of life, but that's not a path that he should choose. That's not a path which the Mishnah is validating. A person has to be true to himself, and he needs a path which is within the integrity, within the while being true to himself, he also earned the respect of others. I think of a case of someone who cultivated a veneer of charitability and respectability and success and an admirable personality within his social circle, whose name has become synonymous with financial fraud on a massive scale. That's Bernie Madoff. He was regarded as a wealthy man. He was a charitable man. He was on the charity circuit. Probably part of the reason he did that was to mix with other wealthy people, Jewish people, so he could defraud them. But until his name, as I said, became synonymous with the most ignominious fraud and hypocrisy, he was quite a respected personality. He was quite well regarded because he cultivated that flashy veneer of charitable activity while covering up hidden corruption. Now, I'm not trying to psychoanalyze him in any way, but I would imagine that such a person would not feel comfortable in his own self. Perhaps he was such a psychopath that it didn't trouble him. But to me, that's an example of this principle, tiferes le'oseha. It has to be a credit to himself and also tiferes lo min ha'adam. Now, what's interesting here is one could challenge this description by wondering, what's the importance of tiferes lo min ha'adam? Is it really so that a person should choose a path? Actually, can everybody hear me, by the way? I just forgot I wasn't using my earphones. Yeah, if you can hear me, then on one previous occasion I didn't have these, and people said they couldn't hear me. Maybe you're happy you're not hearing me. Maybe you're happy you're not hearing me. I don't know.
Oh.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, good. I'm sorry. Yeah, I was getting so enthusiastic about my topic, I forgot the equipment to make it easier to hear me. Yeah, so one could ask, is it really a valid consideration that a person should seek a path which is going to earn him maybe respect or accolades from other people? Is it not vanity for a person to be seeking the attention or the limelight or the validation from other people? If he's true to himself and if he's true to his responsibilities to Hashem, then why does the Mishnah stipulate tiferes lo min ha'adam as well? So much has been written about this, but I'd like to suggest that really what he's referring to is the very important principle of Kiddush Hashem, sanctifying the name of God. The Mishnah in Masechta Yuma asks, it's actually the Gemara itself, asks, Ezahu Kiddush Hashem. What's an example of Kiddush Hashem? If a person conducts his affairs with integrity and with honesty, and he is regarded as with favor by those around him. So people will say, how fortunate are his parents who raised him, who taught him Torah, how worthy and praiseworthy they are, because they have contributed to the personality of this individual who is so highly respected and admired. Of course, if the opposite is true, if people curse the parents who raised him and who taught him Torah, then that, of course, is a chilul Hashem. So what the Mishnah here is saying is that a person should conduct himself in a way that he wins the esteem of other people also. I learned in Yeshiva Chavetz Chaim for 7 years, and before I went on to I learned elsewhere subsequent to that, but my primary yeshiva career was in the Chavetz Chaim yeshiva system. And the Chavetz Chaim yeshiva traces its ideological roots to Slobodka. Slobodka is a suburb of Kovna known as Kaunas today in Lithuania, and it's on the other side of the river. It was kind of a Jewish suburb in its day, no longer. But at that time it was. And there was a great yeshiva in Slobodka. And the Slobodka yeshiva was a Musar yeshiva that emphasized the study of Musar, but a particular path in Musar, which had an emphasis on etiquette, courtesy, to speak in a well-mannered fashion, to dress in a respectable way, in a dignified way, to have an appearance which would win the respect and admiration of other people. So whereas, I don't want to contrast it, but that was an emphasis of the yeshiva, and that is the Tiferes Lomin Ha'adam, a person whose path in life is of such a quality as to win the favor and admiration of others. I sent out circulated on the WhatsApp list, a short clip, about 5-minute clip from CBS. CBS is one of the few major television networks in the United States. There was a 5-minute news clip about a phenomenon which has taken place in the USA in the last probably couple of months in the wake of this coronavirus crisis. And very briefly, those who have had the virus, who have been infected with this disease and who have recovered from it, have antibodies in their blood. And the suggestion is that they can be very helpful to those who have the disease and possibly even life-saving. The news clip featured a particular survivor of COVID-19 who was hospitalized for 2 weeks, or I think for about a month he was hospitalized actually. And his breathing was getting more and more labored. He was reliant on oxygen and his life hung in the balance. He received a plasma transfer from someone who had recovered from the disease, whatever it was, weeks or months before. And that transfusion essentially saved his life. They interviewed a doctor in the Mayo Clinic in Minnesota, I think, and he said that they have performed 13,000 of these transfusions. It's the most ever in the history of the world. 13,000 of these transfusions. Apparently, they're quite rare, but now they're doing them on a major scale. And he said more than half of the donors are Hasidic Jews. And Orthodox Jews. And to me, this was a remarkable Kiddush Hashem. They even had you can take a look at it if you haven't seen it yet. It's only about 5 minutes. They filmed the encounter between this man. He's 59 years old, by the way. And what I mean to say, he's a person of, I think otherwise, in good health. He wasn't otherwise in good health, but he was his life hung in the balance. Anyway, he met this Jacob who donated the blood transfusion from which essentially saved his life. So he met him by Skype or something similar, and it was very moving. The recipient possibly is Jewish, but he's an American guy. The donor is looks to me like maybe 30 years old, Chassidish Yid from Williamsburg. His English was very weak, but the emotions were very strong. And it was very poignant to me, very, very moving. So this is Tiferes Lo Min Ha'adam, to lead one's life in such a way as to create a Kiddush Hashem. But now we have quite a curious statement, because the Mishnah goes on to say, "Veheve zahir b'mitzvah kala kivachamura." Be careful about fulfilling an easy mitzvah as with a difficult mitzvah, a minor mitzvah as with a major mitzvah. She'ena tayodea matan scharan shel mitzvos, because you don't really know the reward for a mitzvah. So since in your estimation, a particular mitzvah that seems to be light is possibly very important, and the other way around. So therefore, you can't afford to dismiss any particular mitzvah as not that important, because maybe it's actually very important indeed. So Rabbi Tursky relates a story he said he heard from his father, that there was a Jew, a young man, who went to Kiev to seek his fortune. And the anti-Semitic legislation in Ukraine, in Kiev, and all of the Russian Empire at that time was intense. And he realized that as a Jew, his chances of getting ahead in life were very slim. So he evidently was not a person of strong religious conviction. He decided to reinvent himself, took on a Russian name, a Russian identity. He shed all trappings of Jewish identity, Jewish associations, and he lived his life as a completely assimilated Russian, possibly Russian Orthodox, even, because in those days to be completely secular was not a way to succeed. You had to be a Christian. So I don't think he converted to Christianity, but he acted as if he had. And he was going about his life that way. One day he read in the paper that the authorities had dredged from the river the remains of a victim, whether of suicide or homicide, it doesn't matter. And he had no identifying features, didn't have his driver's license with him or whatever it was, Teudat Zahut. And but he was wearing tzitzis, a talis cotton. So it was obvious that he was a Jew. They handed him over to the Jewish community for a Jewish burial. Anyway, this man thought to himself, I don't want to live as a Jew because I'm trying to pursue my life and my career, but actually it would be quite nice to die as a Jew, but no one even knows I'm Jewish. I've completely turned my back on the Jewish community. No one even knows who I am. So he decided that I'm going to wear tzitzis. I'll buy tzitzis so I can put it on under my shirt, tuck it into my trousers. Nobody will know. But if it happens after 120 years, maybe sooner, they'll see that I'm wearing tzitzis. They'll know that I'm a Yid, and I'll get a Jewish burial at least. Anyway, after a while of wearing the tzitzis, which he put on every morning, he became conscious of his Jewish identity. So he thought to himself, you know what? There's a lot of food that I can eat when I go out and about. I don't have to eat pork. I can find something else to eat. So he gave up pork, even though the Russians love pork. And after a while, he said, you know what? It's Yom Kippur pretty soon. I'm not going to shul, but I don't have to eat. I'm not announcing that I'm Jewish if I don't eat on Yom Kippur. Anyway, little by little, he realized that there are lots of mitzvot that he can do that will cultivate and will nourish his soul, cultivate his Jewish identity and nourish his soul as a Yid. And over time, he eventually came back altogether to become a Baal Tshuva. It began with the mitzvah kala, the simple mitzvah, because the Mishnah tells us later on that schar mitzvah, that the reward for doing a mitzvah is the opportunity to fulfill another mitzvah. So even that maybe a mitzvah kala, like tzitzis, which is not costly and is not inconvenient and doesn't cramp a person's style or restrict him in any meaningful way, but from that mitzvah, other things can grow. And I have to say that when I read this idea, I thought to myself, I have such an experience also. There was a young man who, before we moved to Golders Green, actually, Sandra Kallenberg, who I see is on our Zoom shiur, she may know even who I'm talking about. A young man, he wasn't really that young, to be honest, but he was single. He was an only child. I think he's possibly was living with his mother. His father had died before, and his mother passed away as well. And he came to shul to say Kaddish for her once a week on Shabbos morning. And we were running, it wasn't at Keshe, it was when I lived in the West End. We were doing a beginner's service at New West End Synagogue in those days. And he realized that rather than sit in the shul where he doesn't understand what's happening really, doesn't understand the Hebrew, etc., just to say Kaddish once at the end of the prayers, or maybe at the beginning and at the end, he'd come to the beginner's service and actually learn what it's all about. I don't want to spend more time than is necessary on this story, but B'kitzur, he, as a result of coming to that beginner's service once a week, after his year of Kaddish ended, he continued to come, came to many of our other programs, he came to our learning programs, he came to our home as a guest on many occasions, and actually, believe it or not, he got married as well. And we made Shever Brachas for him here when we moved into this house. That's how long ago it was. We had just moved in literally 2 days before. We made Shever Brachas for him as well. So actually, the mitzvah kala of just coming to honor the memory of his mother ultimately transformed his life, and he became a shomer Torah u'mitzvahs over time as well. So that's a mitzvah kala. Do not regard lightly a mitzvah kala, because it can lead to great things that follow. Time is nearly up, but I've got two other thoughts that I want to share with you about this idea of kala v'chamura. You don't know what mitzvah is easy and what mitzvah is difficult. Possibly the circumstances are such that for you a mitzvah is easy or difficult, but that doesn't mean that this is minor or major. For example, Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky said, for a person to fast on Tisha B'Av 25 hours in the summer is definitely not an easy thing to do. It doesn't come naturally, and especially it's not a day that has the inspiration of Yom Kippur. It's a day of sadness, and there may be inspiration there as well, but no one would say easy peasy fasting 25 hours, I do it twice a week. Certainly not nowadays. We're not inclined to say that. And yet to eat on Erev Yom Kippur, the day before Yom Kippur, it's very easy. We do it all the time, maybe without a second thought. But it's a mitzvah to eat on Erev Yom Kippur. And although it's a mitzvah to fast on Tisha B'Av, that's a rabbinic mitzvah. And to eat on Erev Yom Kippur is a mitzvah min HaTorah. So even though one is much more difficult to fulfill and one is very easy to fulfill, nevertheless, according to the Torah itself, one is a mitzvah D'Rabbanan, the other is a mitzvah min HaTorah, a Torah obligation to eat on Erev Yom Kippur. So the presumption or the kind of intuitive hierarchy that we may assign to different mitzvahs may actually not accord to the reality. I'd like to just end, and I know it's nearly 9:15, I'd like to end with a great story, which I've told the story a couple of times, but I saw it in print recently in possibly a more authentic version, although I wouldn't be able to vouch for the absolute details of either version, but the story itself goes as follows. Matan scharan shel mitzvahs. You do not know the reward for mitzvahs. We don't know. That's in the next world. And who can assess, who can evaluate the reward that awaits a person in the next world? Only Hashem himself. There was once a man who was a successful businessman, but unfortunately the tide of fortune turned against him and he found himself impoverished. Bad debts, whatever series of setbacks, and suddenly he was plunged from a position of affluence to a position of penury. And he had a daughter who was either engaged to be married or was seeking a husband, and the possibilities were very dim for her because he had no money for a dowry. He was so desperate that he was down to his last ruble, and he picked himself up and he went to visit the Aptarov. That's Rav Avram Yeshua Heschel. the Aptarov, and he explained to him his situation. He poured out his heart, and he asked for a bracha or some kind of assistance, maybe financial assistance or something else that would help him to get back on his feet. The Rebbe said, do you have any money? He said, I'm down to my last ruble. I've got it here in my pocket. So the Rebbe said, okay, I'll give you a bracha that you should invest that ruble, and in Mitzvah Hashem, you will succeed, you'll prosper. Anyway, the man was a bit dejected. He thought, what investment can he do with 1 ruble? But the Rebbe had given his bracha and sent him on his way. So what more could he do? So he made his way back home, and he stopped at an inn. He was sitting there in a dejected manner, and he saw on the table next to him were a few diamond merchants who were showing their wares to one another, describing them, discussing them, analyzing them, planning what they can sell them for, where to sell them to get the best price. Anyway, they saw that he was interested in the diamonds. So they said to him, hey, Rebbe, do you want to buy a diamond? He said, yeah, I would like to buy. He said, well, how much do you have? So he said, ich hab ein Ruble. So they laughed at him, 1 ruble. What do you think you can buy for 1 ruble? He said, well, what are you selling for 1 ruble? Well, obviously, he knew that he couldn't get anything in the diamond department for 1 ruble. But one of these merchants thought he'll have a bit of sport. And he said, well, for 1 ruble, I'll sell you my olam haba. Okay, that I can, I'll sell you for 1 ruble. Not parting with any of my diamonds for 1 ruble. So the man said, with the words of the Rebbe ringing in his ears, okay, I'll do it. I'll buy your olam haba for 1 ruble. But we've got to write it up like a proper bill of sale. Anyway, they started laughing. So one of them took out a scrap of paper and he wrote on it, I hereby sell my portion olam haba to this particular person. They signed it. He handed over the ruble and he took the piece of paper. And he went back to his dinner and they went back to their diamonds. Anyway, after a while, a woman came in, and she was the wife of the one who had sold his, who had made this transaction. So she wanted to know what all the laughing and the raucous laughter was about. So they said, well, this person wanted to buy a diamond, but he had nothing. All he had was a ruble, so I sold him my olam haba. So this woman, according to the version of the story that I read, the diamonds really belonged to her because she inherited them. So they were part of her Yerusha, and her husband was doing business with the diamonds. So she said, what? He said, yeah, I just sold it for a ruble. So she said, I can't live with a man who doesn't have a portion of olam haba. What will be after 120 years? I'll be on my own. He said, I can't be married to you. So he said, no, it's just a joke. He was not really serious. So the man piped up and he said, no, it is serious. He said, I bought it with full intent and I gave you my ruble and I've got the bill of sale right here. So the guy realized that he was in an awkward position, trapped between his wife and the ruble. So he said, okay, look, I'll give you the ruble back. We'll tear up the bill of sale. He said, no way, nothing doing. He said, okay, I'll give you 5 rubles for it. You'll make a 500% profit. He said, no, nothing doing. He said, I won't sell it back for less than 1,000 rubles. Anyway, the man nearly fainted. And he said, you think I'm a schlepper? He said, it's true that I'm down on my luck, but I also was a merchant at one time. And I know what values are. So the man nearly fainted. So his wife said to him, said to the man, she said, if he asks for 10,000 rubles, you've got to buy it back. Anyway, the man was an honest man, though he didn't ask for 10,000, but he insisted on the 1,000. The fellow had no choice because he was caught. So he counted out 1,000 rubles. He handed over to the man. And of course, now he's a happy camper because the bracha of the Aptarov has come true. His ruble has turned into 1,000 rubles. But the story doesn't end there. The woman said to the chassid of the Aptarov, she said, can you introduce me to your rabbi? So he said, yeah. So the next day they went to the rabbi, to Aptarov, and she said to him, tell me, Rebbe, she related the story. She said, my husband's olam haba, how much is it really worth? Is it really worth 1,000 rubles that he had to pay to get it back? And the Rebbe said, mein Frau, mein Tochter, said, at the time that he sold it for a ruble, it wasn't even worth 1 kopek. But when he bought it back for 1,000 rubles, it was worth every penny. So we don't know what schar, what reward awaits a person in the next world. We don't have the means by which to render an exact calculation. And it's probably true that it fluctuates as well, because according to this story, which again, maybe is a bit apocryphal, but according to the story, when he sold it, whenever that was, it wasn't worth anything. When he was willing to buy it back, and he recognized with his wife's urging the seriousness of the matter, and he was willing to pay 1,000 rubles to get it back, then it was valuable. It was worth every kopek of that. Okay, so we'll stop here.